And we have some breaking news just into CNN. The U.S. Supreme Court has just ruled on whether the state of Texas can enforce its controversial immigration law, which would allow state officials to arrest and detain people they suspect of entering the country illegally. Let's go straight to CNN senior Supreme Court analyst Joan Biskupic. Joan, what is the U.S. Supreme Court ruling?
It's saying it needs more time. It has now indefinitely stayed the lower court, a lower court decision that would have let this law take effect. It is blocking this law from taking effect while lower court proceedings play out. The Supreme Court, Jake, had set a 5 p.m. deadline for itself to act on this. As you know, this is a controversial law known as SB 8 that would allow Texas officials to arrest migrants at the border and essentially let Texas take over immigration policy. It's been challenged by the Biden administration and immigrant rights groups. Litigation is playing out, but the issue is, can this law take effect? Supreme Court said it was going to decide that by 5 p.m. today, and now it said it's going to indefinitely continue to postpone the effect of the law. There might be something coming later in the week or later. We're just not sure what the court is doing. Justice Samuel Alito had set that deadline, but clearly the justices are not ready to weigh in on this one quite yet, Jake, as it plays out on the merits in lower courts.
And some more news from the U.S. Supreme Court. They've made a decision or announced a decision on former Trump advisor Peter Navarro's bid to avoid having to report to prison. Tell us about that.
Sure. Last Friday, former Trump advisor Peter Navarro had made a plea to the Supreme Court to try to block his order to get to prison after his conviction on contempt of Congress. And it was John Roberts who issued the one-paragraph decision just a few minutes ago denying that. What he said, Jake, was that Peter Navarro had requested, he'd asked the court that he could remain free while he challenges the conviction, but Roberts noted that the Court of Appeals had concluded that Navarro had forfeited any challenge to the idea that even if he was entitled to executive privilege, that he should avoid appearing before Congress. And John Roberts, alone writing this, said he saw, quote, no basis to disagree with the determination that Navarro forfeited those arguments. So for now, as he continues with his appeal, he will have to go to prison, Jake.
All right, Joan Biskupic, thanks so much for that update. I want to bring in CNN senior legal analyst Elie Honig. And Elie, on the Texas ruling, staying this controversial immigration law, how did we get here? What does this ruling mean?
So, Jake, the state of Texas passed this sort of unusual controversial law known sometimes as SB 4. And what that did is it gave Texas state officials and judges really the power to enforce immigration law, to hold hearings, to deport people who were here illegally. Now, that was appealed by the Justice Department, by the Biden administration. The federal trial court first sided against Texas. They said, you can't enforce the federal immigration law. That's for federal authorities only. It then went to the Federal Court of Appeals, which said the law looks okay and can go into effect. But then the Supreme Court put a stay or a pause on it up until today. And what the Supreme Court has just done, as Joan just said, is to extend that stay, to keep it paused. So the SB 4, the law in Texas, is not in effect as of this moment, and it will be pending further Supreme Court opinions.
How do you expect this case will ultimately come out?
I am quite confident, even though we have a 6-3 conservative majority, that the court will strike down Texas's law. And that's because it is a straightforward, ironclad principle of the Constitution that immigration law, immigration enforcement, foreign policy are for the federal government only. You cannot have individual states applying and enforcing immigration law. It would lead to chaos, and it's against the core tenet of the Constitution. So I do think, if I had to guess, that this law will be struck down eventually by the Supreme Court.
And the Supreme Court also made this decision on former Trump aide Peter Navarro's request to avoid having to report to prison. What does that decision mean?
So he's going to prison now, to federal prison. There's no way around it when the Supreme Court has rejected the request. Worth noting and remembering how Peter Navarro got here. He's got to serve 4 months. Peter Navarro was subpoenaed by the January 6th committee back in 2022. He completely rejected, defied that subpoena. He was then held in contempt. He was tried for contempt of Congress. He was found guilty and sentenced to 4 months. And I think it's interesting that in this ruling, the Chief Justice Roberts, as Joan just noted, he basically said straight up, Navarro has almost no chance of winning his appeal. Therefore, he can't avoid prison. He's got to go in now. He can still make his appeal, but he seems to have very little chance of prevailing.
All right, Elie Honig, thanks so much.